Fab. Just let Cuba in. Right. There we go. So, Ms. Jackson, we've been looking at context this week. And I guess we've been looking at London and what London was like at that time. Also, some of the ideas around science and scientific inquiry and reason and rationality, and then also religion and superstition as well as looking a little bit about Stevenson's life and how Stevenson kind of led a life that was divided in many ways. So, and I know that you're very hot on the kind of psychology behind it. So that might be a good place to kind of start.
Definitely. Actually, what I thought, I like your points about that it's quite difficult to understand the idea of context. And so I thought I might share something that I used to do with my sixth formers to get them to understand context a little bit better, if that's all right with you. So it's not directly linked to Jekyll and Hyde. But what I used to do was I used to give them the song lyrics to Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and I would ask them what it means to them, and then they would kind of talk about it, and it was just I only had about 5 kids in the class because it was a sixth form class, and there was a mix of girls and boys. Well, there was one boy because let's face it was English literature. And it was just interesting because they all had different opinions and all had different links to that song. And I think, sir, that you can probably imagine what the young man's link to that song was. And he was, he straight away went, well, it's rugby. It's all about a rugby song, isn't it, miss? And I was like, is it? And he was like, yeah, it's rugby. And I was like, okay, does anybody else know about this? And the girl's like, no idea what you're talking about. And it was because of his background, his personal experience with rugby, that he had put that context onto that song. Good morning, sir. Thank you for joining us, just for half an hour.
Do I need to? Is it Mr. Boughton? Is it?
No, it's Mr. Jackson. Do you know? There he is. I've got him. I saw him.
Just making my presence.
There we go. You should be able to talk now.
Oh, lovely. Thank you.
Morning. Morning. Sorry, I've got a dodgy mouse button, so I couldn't unclick that either.
That's fine. So he had placed that context onto the song Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and the girls who had no experience with rugby, anything like that, had not made that connection. And so it was interesting to first of all look at their personal context in terms of the literature that that I had presented to them. So first and foremost, it's important to look at what that means to you and how you can apply it to your life, because in actual fact, the higher ability students, what the examiners are looking for is some kind of personal reaction, personal impact. And what's really important as well is to see how these stories relate and how they travel well in time, I guess, and how we can link them to our 21st century. And we have been doing that. We talked about WandaVision last week, and about an unreliable narrator and linking that to Jekyll and Hyde. And that is something that I think that we miss out on sometimes when we're looking at these texts. So I just wanted to make that point first of all and kind of put it in a really simple way. And then what I did as a teacher was actually kind of talk about the historical and social context from when that song was written. And it is a kind of, it is linked to the slavery and the Underground Railway that was used to free slaves or transport slaves to freedom, and so they were learning something completely new about that song, and again putting another layer of meaning way out of their context. So they came in with maybe knowledge of the song, but then after having that lesson, there were, you know, new interpretations of that song that they'd never considered because they didn't know the history of it, and they didn't even know some of the other interpretations of it from the context in which they were living. So I just wanted to kind of say that really before kind of talking about it, because for me, Jekyll and Hyde, because I'm so interested in the psychological aspect, and I am very interested in psychology in general and the idea of repression and the ego and the superego, that is how I choose to read it. And sometimes the other stuff for me gets left out. So it's been really interesting to kind of talk about the latent homosexuality theme that's been in here, because I don't really think about it that much, and the absence of females, and that's something new that I've been able to layer on, and actually links lovely with the stuff that I'm interested in terms of the psychological. But yeah, that's I thought that was a good place to start, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, very, very interesting. Because I mean, you know, it is easy to. It's one of those stories where it's just so much in the culture, and I think you've made this point before, that we know this story even before we've read the text. We know that story of the divided self, or the two people who are somehow mirror images of each other. So that's a really good starting point in terms of context, and then we can go sort of further back and look at other examples of texts that have that duality. And I mentioned in my introductory video Ovid and Ovid's Metamorphosis, which is the classic work really of change and transformation of people being different on the inside to how they are on the outside, and then changing to become what they really are on the inside, like Narcissus, for instance. Is that story of someone who's so in love with himself that he falls in love with his own reflection and falls in and drowns, and then the gods punish him by turning him into a flower. And so that idea of stories of change and transformation is in the culture, and we know them even if we don't know the actual story, even if we've never heard of who Ovid is or who Narcissus is. We kind of know that story, and we know this story, don't we, of this person who's got this double life, this secret life that allows him to kind of express kind of emotions and thoughts that otherwise you would sort of try and control, and I think we've mentioned the Incredible Hulk is probably in pop culture, he's probably our equivalent, isn't he, of Jekyll and Hyde, where that inner rage that's repressed suddenly comes out in an uncontrollable manner, and that's kind of Hyde. That's what Hyde is to Jekyll, I think.
Definitely, and I think that we can talk about it from a psychological standpoint, but I also think that Stevenson uses Jekyll and Hyde, they're obviously two extremes. And I'm not saying, and I think we've made that very clear, that it's not good versus evil, because Jekyll is not, you know, the he's not a representation of the super ego. He is a normal man with faults. But they are two extremes. And I think that Stevenson uses the idea of extremes and the ideas of opposites throughout the novel, in Jekyll and Hyde, in the descriptions of the door in the street, you know, at the very beginning, to kind of represent London in that kind of 19th century, where it was a city of extremes. There was extreme wealth, which we see, you know, with the characters within Jekyll and Hyde, but also of extreme poverty. But again, that's not really highlighted or made explicit. We're not really given an insight into that world, but I do think Stevenson is commenting on it by having these images of extremes, basically. I think it's hinted at, you know, that there is this other world apart from the wealthy, in, you know, the questions that we ask about why is Enfield up at 4 a.m. or you know, why Hyde's flat in Soho. We have hints of it, but we don't fully explore it within the novel, which again is interesting, because we kind of think, if he's making that point about the city being two extremes, why only really explore one? And maybe he's kind of pulling out the faults, that the wealthy aren't perfect. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think it's quite interesting, isn't it? So I'm going to jump in. I think it's quite interesting because roughly at the time when Jekyll and Hyde was being written was the start of people like Karl Marx and Engels writing about the Communist Manifesto. So at that point, kind of 1840s and onwards, actually you had people really starting to think about what is the nature of society. So we've just gone through the Industrial Revolution. People are now starting to have that sense of wealth through that sense of capitalism, but as the rich are getting richer, the poor were getting poorer. And actually people like Marx started to question why it is that some people managed to be rich and some people didn't manage to be rich. I've taught Jekyll and Hyde a couple of times, and at A level at the moment I'm teaching Frankenstein and The Road as A-level coursework comparison. So Frankenstein particularly, most of you will be familiar with, again, this sense of duality, these two personalities. But maybe quite often when people talk about Jekyll and Hyde, they talk about, as Miss Jackson has said, about good and bad, or good and evil, and maybe that's a bit simplistic. Maybe we need to think of them instead about that kind of difference between morality at the time when the text was written against desire. And it's almost like you've then got these two different ways of representation. So not just the id and the ego or the superego, but instead you've got actually this representation through Hyde of desire and that just being unleashed, and this sense of hedonism and just being able to live life to the most, doing what it is that you want without feeling that you've got those boundaries that are there. And then actually you've got Jekyll that is instead almost trying to conform to what it is that society expected him to do. So when society is kind of questioning itself about what it wants to be, who should be in control, who shouldn't be in control, that's why Jekyll and Hyde, at the point where it was written, becomes a really, really interesting text for just getting you to evaluate what your opinions are. And ultimately, the message that comes out of it is that it is neither good to be moral, and neither is it bad to have desire. It's about the ability to have that in moderation. And because he's used it, I'm going to say polarized. So because the good of the goodness is so extreme, and the bad of the badness is so extreme as well, then actually you've got almost by the conclusion of the novel this sense of there has to be something between the two that makes it make sense. I know that you've all talked about lots of different references like Wonderland and all that kind of thing. I've got on the shelf here I'm in my office in School of the Marches. This, which is a book by Audre Lorde, who we talk about quite a lot. And the title of this book is, and it's a quote from one of her poems, which is called "Your Silence Will Not Protect You." And to some degree, I think that Jekyll and Hyde talks about the dangers of not being able to talk about either the good parts of your personality or the bad parts of your personality, what is good, what is bad. And actually, because we don't deal with those issues, then that results in the extreme behaviour that both characters, and then we see the fallout of that through other characters like Lanyon as well. I've talked way too much there, but
No,
I
it's
love
really
Jekyll and Hyde.
Really interesting. I've been doing some, because I think for most of this course from the last few weeks, I've been going down the kind of road that this is a story about repression, and particularly about Victorian attitudes to kind of sex and sin. But I've been doing some research, and the current thinking on Jekyll and Hyde is that Stevenson is a writer who's criticising the British Empire, that this is an anti-colonialist piece of writing. And what Hyde represents is the peoples of the colonies of the parts of the world that Britain conquered. Because if we look at the way that Hyde is described, he's described as a child, he's described as being somehow immoral or evil, and he's and demonic, and he's described as being savage and primitive, isn't he? And this is the very language that people in the kind of who ran the empire from London would use about other people in different parts of the world. And there's something about the fear that what Britain did to those people will come back to haunt them. And this is kind of the fear of immigration, which is kind of hinted at in parts of the book, that, you know, Soho in particular was a place that during that time that had about a population of about 40% immigrants, and people were frightened, as people are today. You know, they're whipped up with this kind of irrational fear of immigrants, that somehow they're going to come and destroy our nation in some way. And that seems to me, I think, what Stevenson's saying about in this book about the empire. He's kind of saying that you can't have an empire based on slavery and violence and oppression and not have this kind of fear that it's going to come back and attack you in some way. And the other point about empire is that in order to have an empire, you have to feel that you're superior to people. But the problem is, people like Freud and people like Darwin pointed out that civilization, this superiority, is paper thin, that actually there's no difference between the races. One race isn't superior to another. That actually there's lots of things going on in our brains which, you know, are animal-like. We're not these kind of godlike superior creatures at all. And I think Stevenson is kind of using Hyde to remind us that, you know, those kind of notions of our superiority because of our civilization are just a facade, just a kind of surface level thing. That, you know, the things we use to justify empire, you know, don't really exist actually, and because of that, we can no longer be, you know, think ourselves superior, which is why he attacks middle class white men, doesn't he, all the time. And there's also something, I think, in Victorian times about this kind of moral panic about somehow this empire will fall because of our own moral corruption, which is why, you know, in the 1880s there's this huge clampdown on being gay, not just in terms of, you know, physical acts of male love, which was, you know, has always been kind of oppressed, but just kind of male friendships, anything that suggested that you weren't, you know, this hyper masculine heterosexual male was clamped down. And it's all to do with that fear that, you know, if we're not man enough, then our empire will crumble. And that's why kind of I think that's kind of what Hyde represents. I feel I'm waffling a little bit, but I hope there's something there.
I think that they're really good points, and just to kind of put a spin on it as well, rather than just fear at the kind of repercussions. I also think that the society was, you know, they were starting to go through a lot of the new theories like Darwin coming out, and there was lots of technological advances, and I think and scientific advances, and I think people were starting to question the lives that they were living and the empire that they were in, and so they were starting to look outwards to other cultures, and authors, artists were looking out to other cultures, and they were being quite pessimistic and dark about their society and where that future lay. So, you know, that fear aspect. But I think that looking out into, you know, other cultures, more savage, which were more free to express the things that were considered sins, or you know, that we were taught to repress in Victorian society, was intriguing and interesting to the Victorian society, and they wanted to kind of learn more about it. I think you know, it's like pieces like, I think it was Dickens who did a piece on a savage culture for I think we've done it in AQA as an extract in the paper too. Those kind of things were becoming more prevalent in newspapers, exploring things like, you know, Dickens's homelessness or houselessness article that are closer to home that we ignored, are being brought more to light by writers and artists, and I think that, you know, we can see it in the Gothic genre, you know, Dracula going outside of that Victorian society, discovering something horrific and bringing it back. That's where the fear is, but the intrigue to actually go and explore is really interesting, as well as not just, you know, fear of what happens because of what we've done, but actual interest and intrigue in these other societies that have got more freedom in terms of their expression than we do. I think is interesting, because that is what Hyde is, isn't he? He is the freedom to express what we have repressed in society for so long.
But I think that where this text is interesting compared to others, like we've talked about Dracula, but going back to Frankenstein and another text like that, that Hyde here has an actual name, has a first name, whereas in something like Frankenstein, that fear of the other is kind of put into the names that are given by Shelley, like creature or monster, and we see that through quite a lot of Gothic texts at this time, and the fact that this duality within Jekyll and Hyde is expressed with this difference between Henry Jekyll and Edward Hyde. Both seem to have that sense of a core British identity. Their names don't seem out of place within British society at that time. But there are people like Wittgenstein and the like that use phrases such as "tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner," to be able to explain something, or to be able to give something a name, gives that ability to be able to explain it away. And whereas in Frankenstein, to some degree, as an example, or Dracula, they're able to be explained in some way or other because, oh, well, it's the creature that did that, and actually we need to now understand how that creature works, and those different issues about how things are developed. Because he is a character, because he has a full rounded name, even though he shares the same persona as Jekyll, actually, well, because it was someone else, then almost it doesn't need an explanation to it. Once the demise of Hyde and the demise of Jekyll happen together, well, it's almost, that's all wrapped up in a tidy little bow. So just because you're talking about WandaVision and the like before, the fact that there are so many kind of open parts within that narrative to allow other characters to come in to keep on explaining and reframing the way that story is developing, because Jekyll and Hyde, rightly, because it's the name of the text, is all around those two characters, then almost you expect there to be a resolution to the ending that's tied up with those. Remember, it's called The Strange Case, and just by that whole title there, we're expected to see then both Jekyll and Hyde as being strange and not representative of the way that people should have been at that time. So all of those different things kind of build together to create, yes, a kind of representation of something that we can recognize within the world at the time, but other enough that we can go, ooh, no, we don't want to be either like Jekyll or like Hyde. We kind of want to be a bit more like characters like Lanyon, who are there in the middle and like the referee between these matches and putting things together.
I say it's Jekyll's trying to give Hyde some level of like respectability, but not quite enough to have to behave like a gentleman. So that's what I always consider the naming that he was trying to give, you know, to make Hyde okay rather than this kind of strange anomaly, and make him more human potentially. When we're thinking about the Empire as well earlier, I was thinking that Empire is inextricably tied up with religion, isn't it? You know, from the Crusades, we kind of considered that we were on some mission to save all these poor people that didn't know about God. And I think, obviously, thinking about Stevenson, he moved away from religion. So, and when you take a religion out of the Empire, what are we doing? We're just invading countries. And there isn't any real reasonable explanation for that, or sort of any benefit to the people from that. So I think that's an interesting idea as well, thinking about it with linking it to religion.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting that we demonize Hyde, and yet Stevenson's life seems to align him more with Hyde than any other character. You know, that rejection of Christianity, that rejection of British society, where he goes to live in other parts of the world. And, you know, judging by his autobiography, he has a very Victorian attitude to the parts of the world he lives in. He's still very much the Englishman abroad, but he is more sympathetic than your typical Victorian to the plight of other nations. So I find it really interesting that, you know, the kind of the culture that we live in has put this, you know, a set up this really simple idea that Hyde is the evil one, Jekyll's the one who kind of gets a bit misguided, but he's actually quite a decent chap. When actually, I think Stevenson is saying, you know, look at Hyde more closely, look at him, you know, and what's he kind of trying to tell us? Well, you know, his rage against Sir Danvers Carew is rage against the political establishment, isn't it? It's rage, I think, against the hypocrisy, because why is Danvers Carew out in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night? There's a suggestion there that, you know, he's doing something that he doesn't want people to know about. But also he represents the establishment. And I think we're supposed to take that murder, that attack, as a metaphorically, that this is, you know, oppressed people striking back at the Empire. This is Star Wars. This is The Empire Strikes Back, isn't it? You know, this is the Return of the Jedi. We're gonna defeat the evil conquerors. And I think that I'm more and more convinced that this is what this book is about, really.
And perhaps then that's echoed then with Dr. Jekyll, that kind of social person that is expected to be respected within the community is almost seen as being the victim, because actually that reestablishes that whole ideal of that's the way that society is supposed to operate. And the fact that it's Mr. Hyde, actually it's a lesser status within that whole kind of social picture. So in some ways it's easier to demonize him in some way or other. That sociology is my background. So one book that is, or one text that is really popular within sociology and looking at people is by Stanley Cohen. It's called Moral Panics, and Folk Devils and Moral Panics.
Yeah.
And clearly what you have within here, because of that, is you've got Dr. Jekyll as being what Cohen describes as being a moral custodian. He is someone that is there to represent what it is that society, and everyone should follow and believe him, because ultimately, as we've seen through things like COVID, if we don't trust doctors to be able to make us feel better and to keep society protected, then who can we trust? And then you have this other term, as he used within the title, of folk devils, and it's almost as though Mr. Hyde is seen as being that, and it links with all those things that we've talked about already this morning about morality and good and evil and the empire, because in order for someone to take over a country or to share an ideology and impose that on someone else, you've got that implication that that is better than what it is that they already have. Americanism, for example, there's always a lot of talk about America being a huge superpower, and other people that are maybe more critical class them as being cultural imperialists, where everywhere around the world you can go to McDonald's and you can have the same type of McDonald's meal as you would have, or you could go to Starbucks, or you would be familiar with Paramount, or all of those different things, and it takes over the world, just as the way that society is reinforcing this idea of these people are good and these people are bad, and if these people are bad, then we need to sort them out, we need to punish them in some way if they're doing something bad, and we need to ensure that other people realize that that is the bad way to do it. Hilaire Belloc created roughly around the same time a collection of what he called cautionary tales, so very much like fairy tales, this sense of all these stories that have a moral within it, just like Aesop's fables about, oh look, if you do this, then this will happen, so don't do this. And this is very much a cautionary tale in that sense as well, of just be careful about what it is that you want within society, because society at that time was at such a dangerous tipping point. Victoria had been on the throne for quite some time, so there was stability to some degree within the way that politics were going to be running and working, and it's only later, and you know that from studying things like an Inspector Calls, about what society was like maybe 30, 40 years after Jekyll and Hyde was constructed, and how the political agenda had changed a bit. Well, actually, if all of those things are stable, then what is it that you can do in order to be able to protect that stability? And that's the question about what is good, what is bad, that is inherent within this story. And on that note, I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to go to another meeting, but it has been a real pleasure. And I'm sorry to just kind of drop that thought bomb and run so that I don't have to try and explain it any further.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you.
It's making me think about the Chartists,
actually,
isn't it? It sort of ties in with the Chartists and the lower class unrest. And obviously that then leading to the demonisation of the lower class as well, because, you know, they were sort of considered, oh, they're very dangerous. What are they trying to do? Why are they trying to change the status quo during Victoria's reign? I don't remember the dates off the top of my head, but I know it's before, I believe, before this point.
1851 was the Great Reform Act.
So quite well before, but it does obviously tie into the fact that and obviously we see it in Dickens as well, don't we? Dickens is sort of showing how the lower classes are oh, it's your own fault. You're here because you deserve to be here. You're somehow inferior or you know, morally not as good as the people higher up. And we obviously see that's, again, Stevenson's commenting on that, isn't he? Sort of saying, well, you know, just two sides of a coin, just luck where you end up.
And there's the French Revolution, which, you know, it happens about, you know, 90, 100 years before this book's published. Yeah, it's still the shadow of it. It's still there. That idea that Europe is just crumbling, it's falling apart. You know, with ordinary people taking over positions of power, and there's a real fear in Britain that this kind of European disease almost will infect Britain. So there's a real fear of, as you say, the working class, the mob, the ordinary people.
There's obviously, even though the Russian Revolution wasn't until 1917, there's a very long build up to that. There's very slow, drawn out kind of crumbling of that. Forgotten the name of it, but the family, the Romanovs.
The Romanovs, yeah. And I think I was talking about what Hugh was saying, you know, about. I look at American films now and the American Empire. If you look at a lot of Hollywood films, they're about this fear of kind of their power being taken away from them, whether that's aliens invading or terrorists or natural disasters. You know, the whole culture is kind of about that anxiety that their great power will somehow, you know, won't last. And I think that's in Victorian times as well. If you look at H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, that's a classic tale of a powerful empire expressing their worry that a more powerful force will come and take it all away. And I think Jekyll and Hyde fits into that fear that, you know, something dark and sinister and mysterious is already infecting London, and it will spread, you know, unless something, you know, it happens to stop it.
Definitely. I'm just having a read. I think we maybe need to get John up here doing a video with us. I was just having a read of them because I haven't been able to.
Can we have a look? I mean, what kind of things is John saying? Should we have a bit of a pause and just have a look at the comments?
I think you guys have replied to it as well, but you know, I like the idea that he said about the book is sort of it shows the fear of narcissists.
And they are, aren't they? They're so obsessed by the way they're seen. They're so obsessed with the way others see them that, you know, and I've said this before, that it ends up Utterson so obsessed with Jekyll and, you know, his reputation that he actually is part of the downfall of Jekyll and his reputation by chasing it so hard, by sort of worrying so much about who this Hyde is. Whereas if he'd left it alone and gone, oh, that's none of my business, and, you know, and equally for Jekyll, he's so obsessed with hiding his own failings or his own desires and wishes that he then creates this kind of monster element of himself.
But then thinks that he can control it.
Yeah. This person that's pure desire and primitive, you know, wishes, and but I can control him with such arrogance, and then you could turn that again and think about the empire, that we go into these you know, huge countries and go, oh, we are now going to lead you, and feel like we can somehow control them, when obviously as soon as India decided it had enough, they you know, they had a revolution and we were sort of booted out, weren't we? So it didn't take a lot in many of the countries we were you know, leading to kick us out of them. And even the ones we're still sort of part of now, like Australia, as soon as they decide to vote against having the Queen as their monarch, they're no longer part of our Commonwealth, are they? So it's all very tenuous.
You know, Scotland, for example.
Exactly, and Wales. You know, all this devolution of like, oh, actually, we don't want to be part of you anymore.
I'm interested in that idea of Jekyll being a kind of romantic anti-hero. Does he fit into that mold? Is he someone who's, you know, like he behaves outside of the rules of society, a little bit self-obsessed and narcissistic, as Mrs. Lanham says, you know, but are we supposed to, in a little way, in some kind of way, be a little bit kind of inspired by him, or you know, see him as a kind of a tortured genius? Is he that figure, or is he something different?
I don't know, but what's interesting is I don't know, I'm going to show my ridiculous side now, but I think if you've ever seen the show Once Upon a Time, where they take like classics, and it was interesting, their spin on Jekyll and Hyde turned out that Hyde was the good guy after all. So I think that at the minute we live in a culture where villainy, it's not just black and white. The best villains are the villains that are villains because of their circumstances beyond their control. We're getting so many more stories about villains' origins. You know, I think of like the Cruella film that's coming out with Emma Stone. It's not good enough anymore for them to just be pure evil. There has to be a reason for it. And you know, Thanos, you know, oh God, I'm not advocating my
this is where your career ends.
Yeah. But my partner, he still maintains that, and I know this from, you know, Twitter and threads and stuff like that, that people like genuinely think that he had a good point, just probably didn't execute it in the best way, you know. So the lines are blurred now, and I think that but I don't know if they were. So I'm trying to think my reaction to Hyde, and it's never been to feel sympathy for him until really these meetings. So it's taken a lot of effort for me to feel sympathy for him. So it's where it doesn't so much in the modern day, because we're kind of geared to the idea that perhaps this idea of pure evil doesn't exist, and it's all down to circumstances, or they've been wronged by the government or by higher ups. So, but I'm just taking my kind of knowledge of films and how it seems to be going at the minute, that there is no clear, I'm trying to think really of a clear bad guy concept, unless it is, like you say, to come in alien-like to threaten the power of, and even then that's not a person, that's an alien entity.
Yeah, I think if Stevenson wanted Jekyll just to be a bad guy, he wouldn't have necessarily worried about chapter 10. That chapter 10 is where he gets to explain himself, and that's the bit where you sort of think, oh well, he did start off with good intention, whereas if I think he was supposed to be just this pure kind of, bad guy, Jekyll particularly, he wouldn't have bothered having that kind of last chapter, especially not from Jekyll's point of view. Obviously Hyde is written in a way he's supposed to be seen negatively. There's nothing positive written about him at all, so it's not surprising that we're led down that route of he's bad, he's evil. And I'm not sure Stevenson ever wanted to try and change that, but I think when you start to think about them as one, not two separate entities, then that's where that kind of question of good and bad really becomes interesting, doesn't it?
But what John is saying in the chat here, that it's like a small reveal, like little bits are revealed to the final, and to be honest, that's really good, because what you do is you make an assumption about Jekyll, that he is the bad guy, he's blackmailing, blah blah blah, but then slowly but surely Stevenson challenges our assumptions and challenges our opinions by adding and slowly revealing more information. And I think that that's what makes a good creative piece, is when it challenges our assumptions and challenges our thoughts and opinions.
It's not like Hyde does anything truly very wrong at the start to get such a reaction that he does. I mean, he bumps into a girl and he walks off. It's not nice, but there's nothing really, it's not horrendous at that point. And it's more about everyone else's reaction to him, how disgusted and hateful they feel towards him, isn't it? And we're supposed to be led by their reactions, because Enfield's this gentleman, whereas Hyde was just he trampled a girl, and it was. So I think we are led down the route, but if you think about it in much more kind of sort of step back and sort of really look at it, you think, well, yeah, he did bump into a girl and he didn't deal with that very well. But if we think of him as kind of almost this childlike, uneducated being, it's not that surprising that he didn't respond in the proper way necessarily.
Agreed.
Try to keep an eye on John's comments.
Yeah, John's brilliant, isn't he?
You should do it for us, John.
Yeah, we need to employ you, John, I think. We've got about sort of 10 minutes left. I wondered at the end, the examiners in their mark scheme talk about a conceptualized response in order for students to get the very highest levels. And I don't know how you two interpret conceptualized response, but I always think about it, what's the big idea of this text? What's the writer really trying to say about the world we live in, really? And I was interested in, if you were, I know this is very difficult, but if you were to kind of sum up what you think that the concept of this book is, what's this book really about, what would you say?
I've taken where the lines like a commentary of Victorian society. Just, I don't quite know how I'd formalise it, but Stevenson is trying to comment on a few different elements of Victorian society. He's trying to comment, obviously we talked about things like the empire and things about class and things about science, but it's kind of, he's taken all the things that are happening in Victorian society and sort of just tried to comment on a few of them in one go and sort of tie them up. So I think there's a few different things going on there, which is difficult, but it's almost his kind of take on the things that are not going right within Victorian society.
Because it's interesting, if I asked you this question about Inspector Calls, I think you would have had a very simple response to that. But this book is so, like you say, there's so many things.
Yeah, there's so many different elements. He's not talking just one thing.
If I was to summarize it in a nutshell, I would say that it is a book dealing with extremes, and that extremes are not a good thing psychologically, socially, historically, and it puts a spotlight on how moderation and managing yourself psychologically, socially, emotionally is something that we need to do individually and within society, in its simplest terms. But I know that that's not.
It's really hard, isn't it? I know I've sort of given you an impossible task, really. Yeah. I mean, I think it's about Stevenson trying to get to grips with the new understanding of the world that comes from people like Darwin and Freud and Marx, which we have, Mr. Jackson talked about it, but we haven't really talked about Marx. But those are the really three big thinkers of the late Victorian era. And this is Stevenson trying to come to grips with the implications of what they've told us about us as human beings, our psychology, but also the way that we organize society as well, in terms of all the things Mrs. Lanham's just talked about, like class and empire and those sorts of things. And it's kind of suggesting that we need to rethink how we do things, because otherwise all the kind of violence and anxiety and repression is just going to be thrown back in our faces, I think. But I don't know. Ask me tomorrow, I might say something different. It's one of those books, isn't it? Really.
That's a good point. John's just saying that sort of this idea that we don't know a lot about our own psychology. I believe that's what he's trying to say, is that we don't really fully understand our own. And they definitely didn't in Victorian times. They still believed in, is it phrenology, where they sort of the shape of the head dictated if you were a mass murderer or something. So, you've come a long way since then, but definitely Victorian times they had no idea. And obviously people like Freud, were just beginning to explore this idea that we weren't just one sort of 2D personality in there. It was kind of, I believe is it id, ego, and I've forgotten the third. Yeah. So it's got 3 elements of your personality, and so it's a good point. They really didn't know a lot. And obviously, again, we can see could explain why it's all kind of difficult to explain, because Stevenson didn't necessarily understand it that well.
This is what I think. Sometimes I think that my reading of the psychological aspects of it is from my own research, which has taken me down that route, and my own interests, because it was a very new idea. So I wonder how much of it is to do with that, and whether that we've placed that because it fits so nicely upon it after the fact. But again, that's what's brilliant about these novels and why they travel so well through time, because or they date well, is because you can put new ideas on them within your society, and they stand the test of time because we can continue to it's almost like you can put your society and your experiences onto the book, and you can still find meaning in the books.
Even well, because he was right in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
If you'd gone the opposite sort of viewpoint and sort of been much more pro what people believed in Victorian times, it would have aged much worse. You would have been back and gone, exactly. About that. Whereas because he was kind of hitting the nail on the head in a lot of areas, it's aged well.
Exactly.
I mean, I'm interested in Lanyon, really. I know Ms. Jackson loves Lanyon. I'm interested because I always think he should be the character who comes out of this the best, and maybe he does in some ways, but he represents kind of rational scientific inquiry, and yet he doesn't quite reach that kind of level of you know, the character who kind of sees the world as it is, and
Yeah.
you know, comes out, he falls short of that, doesn't he? Because he just doesn't understand, you know, what Jekyll's done really, and what Hyde is, and it intrigues me about why that is, because surely the man of science should, you know, be able to observe this with a degree of detachment and work things out, but he doesn't. It's almost like he abandons his scientific mind at that moment when you know, Hyde reveals you know, that transformation.
I always thought. Sorry, go on.
No, I just wondered what you thought of that, really.
I always thought it linked into like this element of the fearfulness of the supernatural and the fearfulness of the unexplained, that he kind of almost represented that fear, which, you know, and he died from shock and the fear of what he'd seen. But it does feel a little bit pathetic, doesn't it? Maybe we're used to slightly more kind of strong-stomached scientists in our sort of more modern fictional characters. Yeah, he's a tricky one, isn't he? It makes for Claire to defend him. Come on, Claire.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
I think that I'm sorry, but if I was greeted with somebody who changed in front of me, I think I would repel and call to God. So I feel like you're being a little bit mean.
Okay.
Because even now in this time, I wouldn't expect somebody to change into somebody I know as well. Into somebody I know, it's just not. It wouldn't be possible. I think that, and even the I beg to differ that even the most amazing scientist would not gasp and.
But there's a difference between gasping and dropping dead, isn't there?
I mean, it doesn't drop dead. It doesn't drop dead. It's a slow process. 2 weeks.
But it kind of, the suggestion is that he abandons kind of all hope in the world, doesn't he? What does he say? Something, if you knew what we really were, or so, I can't remember what he says, but, you know, it basically saying if you knew what we really were, then, you know, you'd give up all hope. And, you know, isn't that, you know, the scientific inquiry mind should be trying to find out what that means and why it works, and it just.
I think personally that literature is full of examples of people who have been given new information and have not handled it well at all. I'm desperately trying to think of an example, and I know there's one, and I'll probably email you about it later. But I'm sure that there is other examples. Hamlet. Yeah. I'm even I'm gonna think on it, because I know in the back of my mind there is some lurking.
I mean, if you think even like, for example, Frankenstein, he creates this monster, and then he sees the monster's alive, and he sort of realizes what he's done. He then goes, "Oh no, you must be evil and bad and terrible. I wash my hands of you," and sort of just. So I mean, it's not quite the same, but it is that kind of like, actually, I'm giving up on my experiment because I don't know, I don't like what I've created. Maybe, I guess. So there's not a brilliant example, but yeah, there must be lots of examples of.
No, I think that's a really good example. I'm trying to think of others now, but I will, because Lanyon is no different to.
Yeah, well, John in the comments is talking about, you know, that fearfulness of what we don't understand being pretty much universal in everyone, really, which seems to me a really, you know, really important point.
And it ties back into class and empire and all the other kind of elements potentially that Stevenson is trying to comment on, doesn't it? That kind of fearfulness, the fearfulness of people that are lower class than us, fearful of people that don't look like us and come from a different kind of, you know, country/continent. So fearfulness is a massive part of the text in general, kind of underlying.
Yeah, well, that's a nice way to end it, because we are coming very close to 10 o'clock. And I'm sure people have got other places to be. So that was our last discussion on Jekyll and Hyde. You might be pleased to know, or you might be disappointed. I've really enjoyed it. I've really changed the way I think about this book because of these discussions. So I thank you all, and you know, even those who aren't here as well. So I've downloaded the register, so you've all got your mark. Enjoy the rest of the day and the weekend. You've got one more little bit of Jekyll and Hyde next week, but most of next week we're looking at a poem that is also an exam text. So we'll send that out sort of over the weekend or Monday morning. So enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you next week. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.